This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. Today we're talking about the very new limited format Murders at Karlov Manor, and as usual, the first video after a format's been around for a few days, when I'm like 10 drafts in, I like to do a 5 early takeaways video. Obviously, it's hard to have anything entirely conclusive, like 10 drafts in and a few days into the format, but there are some things that seem to be panning out in certain ways that I want to share with you based on my experience so far. Alright, so the first takeaway I want to discuss is that I think most of the time you're supposed to be splashing in this format. This format isn't nearly as multicolored as like every other visit to Ravnica has been. We don't have a cycle of common dual lands, for example. But there is still a heavier than normal multicolored theme, and there are lots and lots of powerful uncommons, rares, and mythics that are multicolored. And most of the time when I've drafted this format, I've ended up having, at least one card or two cards that I want to splash because I share at least one of their colors, and they're really powerful. And while there isn't a boatload of fixing in the format, you do have this, the Evolving Wilds that has the make a small creature unblockable upside, and the Clue Land. And both of those are things that I think, I'm not saying this is a format where you should take those really, really high, but it is a format where you should be considering them over middling cards, in most packs, because of the upside of being able to splash like Izoni or something like that. That can come up later in the draft, or it might have already come up. If you're in green, splashing is even easier because you have a few random cards that can do it for you, like the Disguise creature that turns face up, lets you search for a land of the basic land type, and all of that kind of thing. So splashing, I think, for you to have the most powerful deck possible, you're probably usually splashing something. So picking up a couple of pieces of fixing in the middle part of the draft is generally not a bad idea. Another early takeaway is that the format is relatively fast. It's not the fastest format ever. Right now the data on 17 lands says that the average game takes about 9 turns. For reference to what the fastest set ever is, that's Phyrexia All Will Be One, which had 8.5 turns on average. 0.5 doesn't sound like a lot, but it really is. This format is not super, super fast, but, as is pretty much always the case these days, you do need to be doing stuff early or you're going to be in trouble. So, that's something you have to account for. Luckily, they print lots of 1 and 2 drops that are pretty good. So actually having stuff early that lets you trade off with your opponent's things, or cheap removal like Shock, like this kind of thing is around. So it's not that hard to do. But if you find yourself in the third pack and you don't have very many 2 drops, as has pretty much been standard of late, you're going to need to be able to do something in the early game to interact with your opponent in one way or another, or you're going to be in trouble. And on a related note, another takeaway is that the white aggro decks especially are really good. Blue-white and black-white have really, really impressed me overall. White just has really good commons. Novice Inspector was like the most obvious really, really good common of like any card in the set, because it's basically the same card as Thraben Inspector, a card we've seen be so good that it sees play in Legacy, and a card that's always good in Limited. Just paying 1 mana, getting a clue and a body that has a useful creature type is pretty awesome. So blue-white and black-white have both been the 2 most impressive decks, I think, but red-white's been pretty good as well. The white decks basically are all pretty good. And part of it is because white has really high common quality overall. But it's also just that these are the colors that are the best at doing what I was just talking about when talking about the format is fast, which is doing assertive things early, and being prepared for your opponent to just curve out on you. It's something you've got to be concerned about. Red-white decks are more than capable of going super wide in this format. I've really liked Hustle and Bustle a lot, and the data backs up that card's been really good. Being able to buff your whole board at instant speed permanently is a huge deal. Like, it's way better than Inspiring Charge effects, and then having that other side where you can add bodies to the board that are, likely to help you stabilize or maybe finish off your opponent is pretty awesome. But, Hustle and Bustle ends up working in all those white decks. And that is, I think, another pretty big factor of it working, as that color being pretty good, is having that good of an uncommon that just has these modes that are virtually almost always one of them is going to be good for you. And that card's been really impressive. On the flip side of that, the having a really super slow graveyard deck type thing mostly doesn't work so far in the format. I was really hoping that the 3/4 that can get +1/+0, lifelink, and menace, and having the 4-mana enchantment that anytime a creature leaves your graveyard makes a 2/2 token and a clue. I thought all these things that let you add to the board would actually make it viable, hopefully. I was skeptical in the set review just because of how this has gone lately. I was skeptical that sort of deck that has to be inherently slow would work out, and overall they haven't. They're not terrible. It's far too early in the format to completely say one deck's not good, and I've had good graveyard decks in the format and I've had them perform well. But I would say on average, if I'm drafting an aggro deck, I'm just running over those people, and you usually need things to break pretty well for you for it to be good. Now, this doesn't mean that all the cards with Collect Evidence are bad or anything like that. What I mean is that the payoffs for doing that stuff that I was hoping would allow these decks to function as late game decks just haven't panned out. It doesn't, the 4-mana 3/4 that I mentioned that gives you, that can gain you life, and the chalk outline, these things just so far haven't been worth it. And it was a little concerning in the set review because it's okay, first of all, you need to have Collect Evidence cards. Second of all, you need to have a loaded graveyard. And third of all, the cards in your graveyard have to be creatures, which that requirement, I think, might have just been it might have just been a little bit too much to make those cards good. I almost wish they had gone with, and it would have made more mechanical sense in this set if they'd just gone with non-lands leaving your graveyard, so that anytime you could collect evidence, you were doing it, because then you wouldn't have this awkward problem of needing high creature density coupled with needing self-mill and needing collect evidence cards. Instead, it would just be I have a deck, and my cards that go to the graveyard can be removed from it and give me value. But that's not how it works. All the big build-arounds specifically demand creatures, and I think that was just a little bit too much to ask for the deck to be consistent and to be strong enough to get back ahead from behind. And then the last takeaway I have is that Disguise overall has performed really well. I think it's a really fun mechanic in general. There are definitely some bad beats, but there's something fun about not knowing what your opponent has in play, not really knowing what might happen when you block a creature. And, the flip side is true too. That's part of what makes it not feel terrible, is that you're doing it to your opponent too. And most of the cards with Disguise overall have panned out pretty well. I think that's part of the reason Black-White has been so good, because it has all these payoffs for playing things with 2 power or less. And that makes things, a lot easier in terms of triggering these payoffs that are all pretty good. The other really great thing about Disguise cards that, we sort of knew going into the set, because we've seen Morph before, is just that having these cards, these bigger creatures that you can play on turn 3, even when it's an underwhelming creature, a 4/3 flyer or something, being able to play those out on turn 3, have them on the board, have them be able to do stuff well before they ever are 4/3 flyers, is just a big deal. It's inefficient when you look at either side of a card like that. You're wow, so I can either have a Grey Ogre with Ward 2 or a 6-mana 4/3 flyer. And, those cards individually are awful, but one card being able to do both, it's effectively a modal card, it's effectively a split card, and that kind of thing is just powerful and limited. So Disguise, fairly unsurprisingly has been good. Ward 2 does really matter. There are some interesting little games that can happen sometimes where, your opponent has to consider, you have mana up, and they have to consider whether or not turning up their smaller morph creature face up is worth it once it loses ward, or whether they want to leave it face down because of ward. That adds another sort of decision point that I think is pretty interesting overall. And so I've liked that mechanic a lot. I've liked all the mechanics in the set overall, even though Collect Evidence hasn't panned out. Suspect has been pretty interesting too. I've had some decent success with aggressive Suspect decks in the format, so it's not even just the white aggro decks that are really good. So yeah, those are my 5 early takeaways for the format. The format is fairly fast, though not the fastest thing ever. White aggro decks are good. The graveyard decks, like going hard on graveyard stuff, hasn't really worked out so far. Disguise overall has been fun to play with, and it's been powerful, and you should probably try to pick up some fixing so you can splash powerful multicolored cards. Next week we'll have more data. It'll be a meaningful enough amount of data to have, we'll have large enough sample sizes to start talking about what the data means exactly, and as usual, that second sort of video after we've started a new format, I'll take my first look back at my set review and see where I went wrong. So that will do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to see me draft this format, there are already a couple of draft videos up on the channel, and there will be more coming. And if you want to catch up on past Nitsa Notes, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.